The morning mist clung to the weathered steps of St. Mary's Church like a shroud, and Father Miguel's boots echoed against the stone as he approached for morning prayers. The year was 1885, and the small town of Esperanza, Texas, was just beginning to stir under the pale desert sunrise. What he found would change everything. A bundle of faded blue fabric lay against the heavy oak doors, and from within came the softest whimper. Father Miguel's weathered hands trembled as he lifted the blanket to reveal a baby girl, no more than a few months old, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair like spun gold. Pinned to her tiny dress was a note, the ink smeared with what could only be tears. "Her name is Clara. I cannot give her what she deserves, please. Let her know she was loved." The church bells rang out across the dusty streets, calling the faithful to worship, but Father Miguel held something far more precious than gold in his arms. Clara's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and in that moment he knew his life's purpose had shifted. 22 years later, Clara Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she hung the last of the church linens on the line behind the rectory. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, turning the adobe walls of Esperanza into furnaces, but she had learned long ago that hard work was the only antidote to the questions that haunted her nights. "Clara Mica," called Father Miguel from the back door, his voice carrying the weight of his 70 years. "The Hendersons need help with their newborn. Mrs. Henderson is still weak from the birth." She nodded, already untying her apron. This was her life, serving others, caring for the community that had raised her, always giving but never quite belonging. The townspeople were kind, but she saw it in their eyes sometimes. The curiosity, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. As she walked through the dusty streets toward the Henderson homestead, Clara caught her reflection in the window of Morrison's general store. Her features were refined, almost aristocratic, so different from the weathered faces of the frontier families around her. Sometimes she wondered if her real parents had been wealthy, if somewhere out there was a family searching for their lost daughter. But those were dangerous thoughts. Father Miguel had given her everything: a name, a home, a purpose. It should be enough. The Henderson baby was fussing when she arrived, and Clara's natural instincts took over. She had delivered half the babies in Esperanza and nursed the other half through childhood illnesses. Her hands were gentle but sure as she swaddled the infant, humming a lullaby she couldn't remember learning. "You're a natural, Clara," Mrs. Henderson whispered, exhaustion evident in her voice. "You'll make a wonderful mother someday." Clara smiled, but the words stung. At 22, she was already considered a spinster by frontier standards. The young men of Esperanza respected her, but none had ever looked at her with anything deeper than friendship. She was the church girl, the foundling, the one who belonged to everyone and no one. As evening approached, she walked back toward the church, her shadow long against the dusty ground. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up, and she saw a sight that made her heart skip: a massive cattle drive approaching the town, hundreds of longhorns kicking up clouds of dust that turned the sunset blood red. At the head of the drive rode a man unlike any she had ever seen. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and even from a distance, she could see the intensity in his eyes as he surveyed the town. This was no ordinary cowboy. This was a man of power, of influence, a cattle baron. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the desert sun. She hurried toward the church, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't name. Behind her, she heard him giving orders to his men, his voice deep and commanding. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel his gaze following her until she disappeared through the church doors. That night, as she knelt in prayer before the simple wooden cross, Clara found herself asking God not for forgiveness or guidance, but for something she had never dared request before: the chance to be seen, truly seen by someone who might love her not out of duty or charity, but out of choice. Outside, the cattle lowed softly in the temporary pens, and somewhere in the darkness, a man with storm-gray eyes was asking the townspeople about the golden-haired woman who had captured his attention with a single glance. The cattle baron's interest. The morning brought with it the organized chaos of a cattle drive preparing to move on. James Nathaniel Blackwood stood on the porch of the Esperanza Hotel, his coffee growing cold as he watched the town come alive. At 38, he owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, commanded the respect of governors and senators, and had built an empire from nothing but determination and an iron will. But none of that mattered as much as finding the woman from yesterday. "Boss," called his foreman, Tom Riley, approaching with the easy gait of a man who had spent 40 years in the saddle. "The boys are asking about moving out. We've got good weather and the grass is getting thin here." James nodded absently, his eyes scanning the street. "Tell them we'll stay another day. The cattle need rest," and he paused, unwilling to admit that his decision had nothing to do with livestock management. Tom followed his gaze and chuckled. "Wouldn't happen to be about that pretty little thing from the church, would it?" James shot him a warning look, but Tom had been with him too long to be intimidated. "Just saying, boss. In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you change plans for a woman." "I'm not changing plans," James replied, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. The truth was he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. There had been something in her eyes, a depth of feeling, a quiet strength that spoke to something in his soul he thought had died years ago. His late wife, Margaret, had been beautiful and accomplished, the perfect rancher's wife. But their marriage had been one of convenience, of social expectation. He had cared for her, mourned her when fever took her 5 years ago, but he had never felt the lightning strike of recognition he had experienced with one look at the church girl. "Find out about her," he told Tom quietly, discreetly. Tom tipped his hat and ambled off, and James knew that within hours he would know everything there was to know about the woman who had disrupted his carefully ordered world. Meanwhile, Clara was trying to focus on her morning duties, but her hands shook as she arranged the altar flowers. She had barely slept, her dreams filled with storm-gray eyes and a voice that seemed to call to her across impossible distances. "You seem distracted, mija," Father Miguel observed, settling into the front pew with a knowing smile. "Perhaps it has something to do with our distinguished visitor?" Clara's cheeks burned. "I don't know what you mean, Father." "James Blackwood," the priest continued, ignoring her protest. "One of the most powerful men in Texas. They say he owns land from here to the Rio Grande, that he's built schools and hospitals, that governors seek his counsel." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, though her heart was racing. Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Because in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you look at a man the way you looked at him yesterday. And because—" he hesitated, then continued, "because I've been praying for 22 years that God would send someone who could see in you what I've always seen. Not a foundling, not a charity case, but a woman of extraordinary grace and strength." Before Clara could respond, the church doors opened and James Blackwood stepped inside. He had removed his hat, and his dark hair caught the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. He was even more imposing up close, his presence filling the small space with an energy that made Clara's breath catch. "Father," he said, his voice respectful but confident, "I was hoping we might speak." Father Miguel rose, but his eyes twinkled with mischief. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Clara, would you mind giving us privacy?" Clara nodded, gathering her skirts to leave, but James's voice stopped her. "Actually, Father, I was hoping Miss Clara might stay. What I have to say concerns her." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. She looked at Father Miguel, who nodded encouragingly, then back at James, whose gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I'll be direct," James said, stepping closer. "I've spent the morning learning about you, Miss Clara. about your work with the sick, your way with children, your kindness to everyone in this town. But more than that, I've learned that you're a woman of substance, of character." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't understand. I'm asking permission to court you," he said simply, and the words hit her like a physical blow. "I know it's sudden. I know we've barely spoken, but I've lived long enough to recognize something rare when I see it, and what I see in you is worth pursuing." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Clara looked at Father Miguel, who was beaming like he had just witnessed a miracle, then back at James, whose confident facade couldn't quite hide the vulnerability in his eyes. She began, then stopped. How could she explain that she had dreamed of this moment while simultaneously believing it could never happen? How could she tell him that she was terrified of hoping for something so far beyond her reach? "I would be honored," she whispered finally, and James's smile transformed his entire face. "Then it's settled," Father Miguel said, clapping his hands together. "Mr. Blackwood, you're welcome to join us for dinner this evening. Clara makes the finest cornbread in 3 counties." As James left to tend to his cattle, Clara sank into the nearest pew, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The most powerful man in Texas wanted to court her. Her, the foundling, the orphan, the woman who had never dared dream of love. But even as joy flooded through her, a small voice whispered warnings. What did she really know about James Blackwood? What did he want from her? And most terrifying of all, what would happen when he discovered that beneath her calm exterior lay a heart that had been broken before it had ever been whole? Outside, James was giving orders to his men with renewed energy, but his mind was already planning their evening together. He had built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, but for the first time in years, he was acting purely on instinct, and his instinct told him that Clara Martinez was going to change everything. The courtship begins. The dinner table at the rectory had never hosted such distinguished company. Clara had spent the afternoon in a state of nervous energy, preparing Father Miguel's favorite dishes while trying to calm her racing heart. She had changed her dress 3 times, finally settling on her best blue cotton with the small pearl buttons her foster father had given her for her 18th birthday. James arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked himself, an unexpectedly tender gesture from such a powerful man. He had traded his trail clothes for a clean white shirt and dark trousers, and Clara noticed how the simple attire only emphasized his natural authority. "These are beautiful," she said, accepting the flowers with hands that trembled slightly. "I'll put them in water." As she arranged the blooms in her mother's old vase, one of the few possessions that had come with her to the church, James watched her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every movement. "You have graceful hands," he observed quietly. "They tell a story of service, of care." Clara looked up, surprised by the observation. "They're just hands, Mr. Blackwood." "James," he corrected gently. "And no, they're not just hands. They're the hands of a woman who has spent her life giving to others. I find that remarkable." Father Miguel joined them then, and the conversation flowed more easily. James spoke of his ranch, the challenges of managing thousands of head of cattle, the responsibility he felt toward his workers and their families. Clara found herself drawn into discussions about education. James had built 3 schools on his land, and health care, a subject close to her heart, given her work with the town's sick. "You speak with such passion about helping people," James observed, as Clara described her efforts to establish a small clinic in Esperanza. "Have you ever considered what you might accomplish with greater resources?" "I've never had greater resources," Clara replied honestly. "I've learned to work with what's available." "But what if you did?" James pressed. "What if you had the means to build a real hospital, to bring in trained doctors to serve not just Esperanza but the entire region?" Clara's eyes lit up with possibility, then dimmed with reality. It's a beautiful dream, but dreams don't pay for medical supplies or doctors' salaries. James and Father Miguel exchanged a look that Clara didn't quite understand, but before she could question it, James was asking about her childhood, her memories of growing up in the church. I was blessed, Clara said simply. Father Miguel gave me everything: education, purpose, love. I couldn't have asked for a better father. But you must have wondered, James said gently, about your birth parents, about why you were left here. Clara's smile faltered slightly. Of course I wondered, but wondering and knowing are different things. I learned long ago that some questions don't have answers, and that peace comes from accepting what is rather than mourning what might have been. James studied her face, seeing the strength it had taken to reach that acceptance. You're a remarkable woman, Clara Martinez. I'm ordinary, she protested. I'm just a woman who tries to help where she can. No, James said firmly. Ordinary women don't inspire entire towns to be better. Ordinary women don't sacrifice their own comfort to care for others. Ordinary women don't. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. Ordinary women don't make a man reconsider everything he thought he knew about himself. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that this man, this powerful, accomplished man, saw something in her that she had never seen in herself. After dinner, James asked if he might walk her around the small garden behind the church. The evening air was cool, filled with the scent of desert sage and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Tell me about your ranch, Clara said, partly to fill the comfortable silence and partly because she genuinely wanted to understand his world. James's face transformed as he spoke of the Blackwood Ranch, 50,000 acres of Texas grassland, home to 10,000 head of cattle and nearly 100 workers and their families. He described the main house, built of native stone and timber, with wide porches and rooms filled with books and music. He spoke of the challenges: drought, market fluctuations, the constant threat of rustlers, and the rewards of building something lasting. It sounds wonderful, Clara said wistfully, like a world unto itself. It is, James agreed, but it's also lonely. I built it to be a legacy, a dynasty. But what's the point of a dynasty with no one to share it with? They had stopped walking, and Clara found herself looking up into his face, seeing vulnerability there that he probably showed to very few people. You were married before, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Everyone in Texas knew the story of James Blackwood's wife, who had died of fever 5 years earlier. I was, he confirmed. Margaret was a good woman, a suitable wife, but our marriage was practical, expected. I cared for her, but I never felt, he struggled for words, I never felt like I was truly alive until yesterday, when I saw you. Clara's breath caught. James, you barely know me. I know enough, he said, reaching out to touch her face with gentle fingers. I know that you have a heart big enough to love an entire town. I know that you're strong enough to build a life from nothing and generous enough to give it all away. I know that when you smile, something in my chest feels like it might burst. And I know, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, that I want to spend the rest of my life learning everything else there is to know about you. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. For 22 years she had been the caretaker, the giver, the one who stood strong for others. But in this moment, she felt cherished, protected, seen in a way that made her feel like she was finally, truly home. I'm scared, she admitted. Of me? James asked, concern evident in his voice. Of this, Clara said, opening her eyes to meet his. Of hoping for something so beautiful that losing it might destroy me. James's thumb traced her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then we'll build something so strong that you'll never have to fear losing it. As they walked back toward the church, Clara felt as though she was floating. The impossible was happening. She was falling in love with a man who seemed to love her in return. But even as joy filled her heart, A small voice whispered warnings about the vast differences between their worlds, about the secrets that might yet come to light, about the fragility of dreams that seemed too good to be true. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows, or the way the stranger's eyes narrowed as he observed their tender interaction. Some secrets, once buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface, and Clara's past was about to catch up with her in ways she could never have imagined. Love and revelations. 3 weeks had passed since James Blackwood first walked into St. Mary's Church, and in that time, Clara's world had been transformed. Every evening he would arrive at the rectory with flowers, books, or small gifts that showed how carefully he listened to her dreams and desires. They would walk through the town, talking about everything and nothing, and Clara found herself falling deeper in love with each passing day. The townspeople of Esperanza watched the courtship with fascination and approval. James had proven himself to be not just wealthy but generous, contributing to the church fund and helping several families with medical expenses. More importantly, they could see how he looked at Clara, with the reverence of a man who had found something precious beyond measure. "You're glowing, mija," Father Miguel observed one morning as Clara hummed while arranging altar flowers. "Love suits you." Clara blushed but couldn't deny the truth. "He's asked me to visit the ranch next week. He wants to show me his home." "And?" Father Miguel prompted, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes. "And I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "His world is so different from mine. What if I don't belong there? What if he realizes I'm just a simple church girl who doesn't know anything about being a rancher's wife?" Father Miguel set down his prayer book and took her hands in his weathered ones. "Clara, listen to me. You have spent your entire life believing you were less than others because of how you came to us. But the truth is, you are extraordinary. You have a gift for healing, for bringing peace to troubled hearts, for making everyone around you better. James Blackwood sees that. The question is, when will you see it in yourself?" Before Clara could respond, the church doors burst open, and a stranger strode in. A well-dressed man with cold blue eyes and an air of barely contained fury. "Where is she?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping the church until it landed on Clara. "Where's my daughter?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think you're mistaken." "No mistake," the man said, pulling a daguerreotype from his coat pocket. The image showed a young woman with Clara's exact features holding a baby. "You're Catherine Elizabeth Worthington, and you're coming home with me." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara gripped the altar rail for support, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. My name is Clara Martinez. I was abandoned here as a baby." "You were stolen," the man, her father, said harshly. "Father, taken from your nursery by a servant girl who thought she was saving you from some imagined danger. I've spent 22 years searching for you, and I'll be damned if I let you slip away again." Father Miguel stepped forward, his voice steady, despite the shock. "Mr. Worthington, Charles Worthington of the Worthington Railroad fortune, and you, priest, have been harboring my daughter illegally." Clara's legs gave out and she sank into the nearest pew. The Worthington name was known throughout the country. They were one of the wealthiest families in America, with holdings in railroads, steel, and banking. If this man was telling the truth, then she wasn't a foundling at all, but an heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the nation. "The servant girl," she whispered. "What happened to her?" Charles Worthington's expression softened slightly. "Maria Santos. She was your nursemaid and she loved you dearly. She overheard a conversation between your mother and me. We were discussing sending you to boarding school in Europe, away from some business troubles we were having. Maria misunderstood, thought we were abandoning you. She took you in the night, intending to bring you back when things settled down. But she never did," Clara said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "She died of fever 3 days after leaving you here." Charles continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "The authorities found her body but no trace of you. We assumed, we feared the worst." Clara looked at Father Miguel, who was pale but composed. "Did you know?" she asked. I suspected, he admitted quietly. Maria was delirious when she brought you, speaking in Spanish about danger and protection, but she died before she could explain, and you were so young, so in need of care. I thought it was better to let you grow up here, loved and safe, than to send you into an uncertain world. The church doors opened again and James Blackwood entered, his face lighting up when he saw Clara before darkening as he took in the tense scene. Clara, what's wrong? Charles Worthington turned, his businessman's instincts immediately assessing this new arrival. And you are? James Blackwood, he replied, moving protectively toward Clara. I'm courting Miss Martinez. Miss Worthington, Charles corrected sharply. And that courtship is over. Catherine is coming home to take her rightful place in society. No, Clara said, finding her voice at last. She stood, her chin raised with newfound determination. I won't be told what to do by a stranger, even if that stranger is my biological father. Charles's eyes flashed with anger. You're my daughter, my heir. You have responsibilities. I have a life, Clara interrupted, surprising everyone with her strength. I have people who depend on me, work that matters to me, and she looked at James, her heart in her eyes. And I have love. James stepped forward, taking her hand. Whatever this is about, we'll face it together. Charles Worthington studied the interaction, his business mind calculating. Mr. Blackwood, I've heard of you. You're successful, but you're not in our league. Catherine is worth $50 million. She can marry a duke, a senator, someone who can elevate the family name. I don't want to marry a duke, Clara said firmly. I want to marry a man who loves me for who I am, not what I'm worth. And who is that? Charles challenged. You're Catherine Elizabeth Worthington, daughter of one of the most powerful families in America. You were born to privilege, to responsibility. This simple life is beneath you. Clara felt anger rise in her chest, not at learning the truth about her birth, but at the dismissal of everything she held dear. This simple life has taught me compassion, service, and love. If that's beneath me, then I choose to stay beneath. James squeezed her hand, his admiration for her courage evident in his eyes. Sir, with respect, your daughter is the most remarkable woman I've ever known. If you can't see that, then you don't deserve her. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Through the window, Clara could see a fancy carriage surrounded by armed men. Her father had come prepared for resistance. I'm not leaving, Clara said quietly but firmly. This is my home. These are my people. And this, she looked at James, is my choice. Charles Worthington's face was a mask of frustrated fury, but there was something else there too, a grudging respect for the strength his daughter was showing. Very well, he said finally, but this isn't over. You are a Worthington, Catherine, whether you accept it or not, and Worthingtons don't hide from their destiny. As he strode from the church, Clara collapsed into James's arms, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just been revealed. She was an heiress, a woman of unimaginable wealth and social position. But more than that, she was a woman who had just chosen love over luxury, authenticity over expectation. Are you all right? James asked, his voice tender with concern. Clara looked up at him, seeing the same love in his eyes that had been there before her world turned upside down. I'm exactly where I belong, she said, and meant it. But even as they held each other, both knew that Charles Worthington was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The battle for Clara's future and their love was just beginning. The choice that changed everything. The news of Clara's true identity spread through Esperanza like wildfire. Within hours, the small town was buzzing with the revelation that their beloved church girl was actually Catherine Elizabeth Worthington, one of the wealthiest heiresses in America. Some townspeople were awed, others felt betrayed, and a few wondered if she would abandon them now that she knew the truth about her fortune. Clara spent the night in prayer, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. In the space of a single day, everything she thought she knew about herself had been shattered and rebuilt. She was not an abandoned foundling, but a stolen child. She was not poor but unimaginably wealthy. She was not without family but the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. James had stayed with her through the long hours, holding her hand as she processed the enormity of the revelation. He asked no questions about her decision, made no demands, simply offered his steady presence as she navigated this new reality. "What are you thinking?" he asked as dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I'm thinking," Clara said slowly, "that I understand now why I always felt different, why I never quite fit. But I'm also thinking that the life I've built here, the person I've become, that's real. That's mine. And your father? His expectations?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "He's not wrong about responsibility. If I truly am worth $50 million, then I have an obligation to use that wealth wisely. But I won't be forced into a life that isn't mine to choose." Before James could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Charles Worthington had returned, but this time he was alone, his expression more thoughtful than angry. "Catherine," he said as he entered the church, "I've spent the night thinking about our conversation yesterday." "Clara," she corrected gently but firmly. "My name is Clara." Charles nodded slowly. "Clara, then. I've been investigating your Mr. Blackwood, and I must admit I'm impressed. His ranch is profitable, his reputation impeccable, and his treatment of his workers exemplary. More importantly," he looked directly at James, "it's clear that he loves you genuinely, not for your fortune." James straightened, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I loved her when I thought she was a penniless orphan, sir. Her wealth changes nothing about my feelings." "Perhaps not," Charles agreed, "but it changes everything about her responsibilities. Clara, you are the sole heir to the Worthington fortune. When I die, you will control assets worth more than most small countries. You cannot simply ignore that reality." Clara stood, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "You're right. I can't ignore it. But I also can't abandon the life I've built, the people I love, the work that gives my life meaning." She took James's hand, drawing strength from his presence. "I propose a compromise. I will acknowledge my heritage and accept my inheritance, but I will use it on my own terms. I want to build hospitals, schools, and clinics throughout Texas and beyond. I want to create something that serves people, not just profits." Charles raised an eyebrow. "And your personal life, your marriage plans?" "I will marry James Blackwood," Clara said without hesitation. "Not because he's suitable or advantageous, but because I love him and he loves me. Our marriage will be a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values." "And if I refuse to accept this arrangement?" Charles asked. Clara's smile was sad but determined. "Then you'll lose your daughter again, this time by choice rather than circumstance. I've lived 22 years without the Worthington name and fortune. I can live the rest of my life without them too, if necessary." The silence stretched between father and daughter, a battle of wills that would determine not just Clara's future, but the legacy of the Worthington name itself. Finally, Charles smiled, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him. "You are definitely my daughter. You have your mother's heart, and my stubborn streak. Very well. We'll do this your way, but with conditions." "Which are?" Clara asked. "First, you'll spend time in New York, learning about the business, understanding your inheritance. Second, you'll maintain the Worthington name alongside whatever name you choose to take in marriage. And third," he looked at James, "your husband will become a partner in our enterprises, not just a beneficiary of our wealth." James stepped forward. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I have my own ranch to run, which will become part of a larger network of agricultural and business interests." Charles replied smoothly. "I'm not asking you to abandon your life, Mr. Blackwood. I'm asking you to expand it." Clara looked between the two men, seeing the possibility of a future that honored both her past and her dreams. "What do you think?" she asked James. "I think," James said slowly, "that we can build something extraordinary together. Your compassion, my experience, your father's resources. We could help thousands of people. Then it's settled, Charles said, extending his hand to James. Welcome to the family, son. As the two men shook hands, Clara felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She was no longer the abandoned foundling or the simple church girl. She was Clara Worthington Blackwood, a woman who had chosen love over convention, service over luxury, authenticity over expectation. 6 months later, the wedding of Clara Worthington and James Blackwood was the social event of the decade, attended by governors, senators, and business leaders from across the country. But for all its grandeur, the ceremony took place in the small church of St. Mary's in Esperanza, Texas, with Father Miguel performing the service. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers picked from the Texas prairie. James wore a simple black suit, his eyes never leaving his bride's face as she walked down the aisle. Do you, James Nathaniel Blackwood, take Clara Elizabeth Worthington to be your lawfully wedded wife? Father Miguel asked, his voice thick with emotion. I do, James replied, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Clara Elizabeth Worthington, take James Nathaniel Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked into James's storm-gray eyes, seeing their entire future reflected there. I do, as they kissed, sealing their union. The church bells of St. Mary's rang out across the desert, calling the faithful to witness a love that had overcome every obstacle, a love that would build hospitals and schools, that would serve the poor and heal the sick, that would prove that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in gold or silver, but in the courage to choose love over everything else. In the years that followed, the Blackwood Foundation would become one of the most respected charitable organizations in America, building hospitals across the frontier and bringing medical care to those who needed it most. Clara and James would have 4 children, each raised with the values of service and compassion that had brought their parents together. And in the small town of Esperanza, Texas, the story would be told for generations of the foundling who became a cattle baron's bride, who chose love over luxury, and who proved that sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin on the humblest church steps. Charles Worthington, watching his daughter dance with her new husband, smiled with satisfaction. He had found his heir, but more than that, he had found his daughter, a woman who would carry the Worthington name with honor, while never forgetting the lessons learned in a small Texas church. The abandoned baby had become a bride, the foundling had become a philanthropist, and the church girl had become a woman who would change the world, one act of love at a time.